Welcome to Minerva, it is Jo, and today I'm going to show you how to make a handmade buttonhole. You might use a handmade buttonhole if you've got extra thick fabric. So if you're making a jacket, or you're tailoring, or you're making a coat or a coatigan, or a long shacket or something that has thicker fabrics, then you might consider making a hand-sewn buttonhole. Fabrics you might do this with are boiled wool, boucle. So boucle has a sort of texture, so if I zigzag that with the machine, I'll press all of the texture out and all you'll see is a zigzag outline, whereas a hand sewn buttonhole can be a little bit more subtle. It's also quite good if you've got a slight stretch in your fabric, because a presser foot can sometimes ripple buttonholes if you do them on the machine, whereas you can have more control if you sew them by hand. Hand sewing them is one of those skills which you get better at the more you do, so it's a sort of practice makes perfect kind of scenario. So I'm going to show you today the technique of making a buttonhole. Mine don't look great because I'm using a contrasting thread. I haven't done one for ages, but I want to show you the process of it and the technique of it, and you'll see at the end when I make one with matching thread, it's a really neat buttonhole. You might find that a beeswax is useful if you're sewing a buttonhole, because you're turning the thread over and over, so you're twisting the plies in your threads and you'll get a few knots, because you're going to be making a very tiny blanket stitch. If you wax your thread before you start, then it just gives your thread a little bit of stability, so that your threads won't twist when you're trying to sew them, and it also makes quite a crisp edge on your buttonhole. I'm sort of leaping around between buttonholes, but I'm showing you each little bit of the process. You will mark out your buttonhole with chalk, and then you mark out the edge of the buttonhole with a running stitch, and then you can blanket stitch around the edge, and then you decide which finish you want for the ends. Do you want a bar tack straight edge, or do you want a fan curved edge? It's always good to do a test handmade buttonhole, because you want to see if your button will go through the hole before you do any cutting on your fabric. Because the difference between a machine one and a hand sewn one is, on a machine one you sew it, and if you don't like it you can unpick it and move it or change it, and then you cut the hole. But with a hand sewn one, you mark it and cut it and then you sew it, because it encloses all of the raw edges, so you don't get any frayed bits. So you need to make sure that the hole you make is exactly the right size, so you must always do a test one first. On your test one, it's important to use the same layers that mimic your garment. So if you've got a jacket with a facing, and on that facing is some interfacing, then layer up your outer, a little piece of interfacing, and your inner, and if that's a different fabric as well, make that difference, so that you can just hone your technique on the test. If you've got an interlining, like a really very thin layer of wadding, say in a coat collar, and you need to practice the buttonhole for the top on, which is in slightly thicker fabric, then mimic that in your test piece. So make sure you've got all of the layers that you want to test, and mark out your buttonhole with chalk. Next, you're going to mark the edge of the buttonhole with a running stitch. Now I'm using an embroidery thread here because this is going to be a raised buttonhole, but you can just do a running stitch around if you want a very slim flat buttonhole, or you can use a thicker thread and do a back stitch that's completely filling in the chalk line if you want a raised buttonhole which is slightly thicker. You can snip your knot off now because all of that is secure. You don't want a lump at the end of your buttonhole. There it is, a nice little raised line to follow. Next, you need to cut your buttonhole. This is a buttonhole cutter. It's great for thick fabrics. So it's like a little mini chisel, and you put it in the buttonhole slot and hit it with a hammer. It's very sharp, so you don't need to really bash it or anything. And it makes a really clean buttonhole cut. You can put a little bit of fray stop glue around that edge if you've got a particularly fraying fabric, but you'll just need to wait for that to dry. Time to get your needles and wax your thread. So pull the thread through the wax so that it's got a really fine coating, and you'll feel the difference straight away. Thread up your needle, and on this one I've already been round once, but I'm going to keep the running thread running along the slit of the buttonhole. The needle enters from the outside of the buttonhole line into the fabric and through the buttonhole. You need to make sure that the thread is going behind the needle, and that's a really tiny blanket stitch. So the thread goes along the line of the buttonhole, you insert from the outside through the hole, and then draw up the thread so that it's a nice little, it looks like a little fence running along your buttonhole. One more time, in the outside through the hole, and the thread is behind the needle. You need to sort of line them all up. So I've been round once and now I'm going round and I'm filling in the spaces in between. It looks a little messy with a red thread. If it was a matching thread, you wouldn't see it so much, so you'd get a really nice sort of line of stitches along the edge. You can place each stitch in the position that you want it to be. There you are, so that side's got a double row of stitching. You don't do the ends yet, so you just do the two sides of the buttonhole and leave the ends, and I'll show you how to finish those in a moment. So there we are, you can see the side, that side's only had one layer, and I've made little markers, and the other side has been filled in. I've got the end that I'm going to work now, so I've worked this end as a fan, so you get a sort of rounded edge buttonhole. You get the little row of stitching that makes the edge of the buttonhole. And on this end I'm going to do a bar tack. Okay, moving back to the other one, we're going to repeat the skill here of the blanket stitch, but we're going to go over the top of that tacking line, and because it's an embroidery thread, it's quite raised. So I'm going round first of all with a single row of thread. So my thread is running single, and I'm just marking out every sort of millimetre the edge so that I can hold all of that tacking down. So I've got it all held down. I'm going to finish off with my single thread so that I can make this a very thick prominent buttonhole. So this time I'm going to use 2 lines of thread. So I'm waxing a much longer piece because I'm going to run this thread double. Thread up my needle and tie the 2 ends together. I want the knot to be at the back, and I'll be cutting that off once I've got the sewing going, so just hold that down out of the way. And now I'm going to do a stitch in between each of those ones that I did with a single thread. It's harder working with a double thread because it's waxed, it doesn't slip through quite so much, and also sometimes if you've got a particularly long thread like I've got here, then you do get a little bit of knotting, so you just need to make sure the yarn is round the back of the needle and then pull it gently. There we are, and just keep that flat and just try and work each double thread stitch in between each single thread guide. At the end of this one, I'm going to do a bar tack. You wouldn't normally do a different style on each end, but I'm just showing you the two different techniques. And then you can knock that off at the back and snip the threads. So there we are, that one has got the bar tack at the end and the round bit at the other end. You can change the shape of your buttonhole. That one's a really thick one, that's the thin one with a single thread. You can have it square like this, or you can try a keyhole buttonhole, and the button goes at this end here. The fan end goes on the outer edge of your jacket. Here we've got a much thicker fabric, so this is a wool fabric for, say, a coat. It's got a interlining, but I'm using matching thread, and you can already see the difference in the quality of the buttonhole. You need to tie off the end and tunnel your thread through the buttonhole. You can snip that off. You can test your buttonhole, so it needs a little bit of tension but not lots, and you should see just the buttonhole either end. Obviously my end you can't see, but that's the top stitched end. We've got a thicker one, a single thread, keyhole or straight, and here's one now with the matching thread, and you can see it's got a lovely edge. It looks really professional compared to the other side, which is done with the top stitching thread, which you can see. Depending on the threads you use will depend on what sort of buttonhole you get. So if you use an embroidery floss, you'll get a very prominent buttonhole, one that's a feature. So if you really got good hand sewing skills, you can try that. You can try splitting the threads and just having 3 strands of the floss. I used it to make my raised buttonhole, my one that was very, very strong. So I used that for the tacking as a base, and then threaded over the top. I used top stitching, that was the red thread that I used, so that was nice. When that was waxed, it sort of mimicked an old vintage button thread, so that made a strong edge. It was good though because I could use it on its own as the single row, and then when I doubled it up it made a thicker row for coverage. You can also try a pearl 8 thread, so this is a thicker thread with a slight sheen. If you can get a good match for your colour, that makes a sort of statement buttonhole. Or if you've got a tiny buttonhole, so you're making some on a little tailored shirt and you want to finish it with hand buttonholes, then you can use an all-purpose thread or a silk thread, and that's much more fine, so you'll need to put more stitches in between your marker stitches. So you can also experiment with the different types of threads that you use, and that will depend on the finish that you'd like your buttonhole to have. I hope that little technique video has helped you today. You might not do them very often, but when you do have that skill, then you might be able to pick between that and your sewing machine for the best finish on the fabric that you've chosen. Of course, you might be sewing on a vintage sewing machine or an old sewing machine and not have a buttonhole feature, so then you'll be getting really great at hand sewing buttonholes. Do call again to Minerva to check out more sew along videos and tutorials, tips and techniques. We would also love to see your projects and all the things that you've made. It doesn't have to be garments or tailoring, it can be any craft. We love to see what people are making. Do make an account with us, share your makes and enjoy the inspiration and comments from our sewing community. If you make a buttonhole in a different way, then you can add that in the comment below, because it's always good to share new ideas. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.